Now, the U.S. Defense Secretary has urged Congress to approve a massive funding boost for the military. The Trump administration is pushing for a $700 billion defense budget for this year, rising to $716 billion in 2019. RT's Caleb Morpin has more.
Well, James Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, was speaking before the Congressional Armed Services Committee. In his remarks, he talked about how both Russia and China were, in his view, a major threat to the United States because they were updating their nuclear arsenals.
While Russia has reduced only the number of its accountable strategic nuclear force, Russia has been modernizing these weapons as well as other nuclear systems. Moscow advocates a theory of nuclear escalation for military conflict. China, too, is modernizing and expanding its already considerable nuclear forces, pursuing entirely new nuclear capabilities.
Now, these words come from a country that recently updated its nuclear weapons doctrine. The U.S. Nuclear Review was recently released, and in the review, the United States named Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea as potential threats to the United States. They could essentially attack these countries with nuclear weapons in what they deem to be extreme circumstances, and that includes non-nuclear situations. Later in his remarks before the Armed Services Committee, Mattis actually talked about increasing the U.S. military budget. At this point, the United States has the largest military budget of any country in the entire world. It's bigger than the top 8 other countries combined. However, James Mattis says that it's just not enough. This is what he said.
No strategy can survive, as you pointed out, Chairman, without the funding, and insufficient funding have created an overstretched and under-resourced military. Congress must commit to both an increased and sustained investment. We must be good stewards of the tax dollars and support the budget for our military. We need Congress to lift the defense spending caps and support the budget for our military. No strategy can survive without the necessary stable, predictable funding.
If you need more money for weapons, who is better to scare the U.S. public with than Russia?
Well, we're joined live now by Gregory Coakley, editor of Defence and Foreign Affairs and president of the parent organisation, the International Strategic Studies Association. Thanks for joining us. Good to have you on the show. A 13% rise in military spending, given the US has the largest military already in the world, of course. Is that really justified, do you think?
Well, it's justified because the US military is substantially out of date. It spent the last couple of decades fighting wars, not planning for new wars. So it's actually got a military which has been largely geared to fighting yesterday's wars. And it needs that new doctrine, whether it's nuclear or conventional, to reorient itself towards the threats of the future or the possibilities of future conflict. And it's not a matter of whether it has the largest military budget in the world or not. The fact is that its military force is not yet optimized for taking the role of global projection, power projection, into the next few decades.
Well, just something you mentioned there, the nuclear issue as well. I mean, Mattis defended Trump's administration's plans to modernize the nuclear arsenal. Could this really undermine, US efforts to persuade other countries to scale back on their own arsenals?
Well, I might ask you the same question. Could Russia or China's modernization, nuclear modernization activities over the past few years do the same thing? The reality is that if you've got any kind of defense force, whether it's nuclear or conventional, it has to be appropriate technologically to the current and projected environment. The US nuclear weapons are out of date, haven't been modernized for a long time. They have been geared, in fact, to the mutually assured destruction doctrine, which means a fairly blunt instrument of heavy throw weight and heavy and large nuclear warheads. The reality is that for nuclear warfare to be viable in the future, as we see a changing context, with one in which we see much more cyber warfare, the reality is that they're going to need to be much more flexible, smaller, and more nimble nuclear force. And that's what Russia's been doing. That's what China's been doing. The reality is that Russia and China are, I would suggest, in many ways ahead of the United States in developing their new generation nuclear weapons.
I mean, speaking of Russia and China, Mattis singled out both those countries, as well as North Korea, as, justifications for this rearmament or upgrades, as you call it. But do you think any of these countries actually pose a military threat to the US? If we rule out a nuclear holocaust, conventionally the US still has the most powerful military, it maintains almost global hegemony here. Do you see Russia-China as a realistic nuclear military threat to the US?
Well, what any government, whether it's Russia, China, the US, or for that matter, Australia, they have to plan against capabilities, not against intentions. My own personal view is that Russia in particular does not pose an imminent threat simply because there's too much mutuality of interest with the United States and the West to move towards a nuclear confrontation. But what you plan for, if you're a military planner, is not intent, you plan against capability. And as long as Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and for that matter, India and Pakistan, or Israel for that matter, as long as these countries have nuclear weapons, they have to be taken into account when planning one's own capabilities and defenses, whether it's to defend against incoming ballistic missiles or nuclear weapons, or whether to project dominance.
Indeed, I think if anything, this highlights the need for dialogue and communication as a key amongst all these superpowers. Gregory Copley there, author and strategic analyst. Thanks for your time here today on RT International.
Thank you.